The purpose of telling this story is not to insult any particular religion or to sell a particular fairy tale. The only purpose of telling the story is to give us a sense of real purpose for the gene pool and soul group. You know how we talked about Australia as having a potential role as the crest of the wave of spirituality from the legend of the golden dolphin circling the planet? So the refusion of the soul group could happen here. So Australia gets a little sense of soul purpose. It creates a bit of national identity. Well, now we have the planet. And the planet imagined itself to be an orphan in that we imagined that the DNA on Earth came from Earth. That was a mistake. Clearly it did not. Some evidence that the DNA on Earth did not come from here include, if you take the Sumerian alphabet, the Sumerian glyph structure, and you shine lasers through them, you fabricate subcellular structures in biophysics. The Sumerian elixirs of the MD microscopist George Merkel in Texas. So clearly the Sumerian alphabet is an optical waveguide system for creating cellular metabolism. Lots of evidence. Sumerian elixirs. Evidence B, the Hebrew alphabet is the tilt angles of a magnetic domain referenced by the symmetry of the tetrahedron in order to tilt DNA codons into a tetrahelix they call a golem. So that the Hebrew alphabet was a software environment for interventionist genetic engineers. Okay? So these are two examples of the origins of language on this planet being specifically evidence that the origin of culture on this planet was in fact interventionist genetic engineering. Now, in fact, the major issue of our soul group today is the fact that our DNA is getting dizzy because our genetic engineers do not understand how to make a soul. This is a problem. So here we are, Groundhog Day. You know, it's like all coming back on us again. Our ancestors hacked up DNA, and that fractionation of their soul group, we're the result of their dream, right? And now we're repeating their mistake. So history condemns those who do not understand history are condemned to repeat it. So here we are. We must understand the extraterrestrial origins of the DNA here and what the yearning was. And that's what this story is about. Okay. Once upon a time, there were two families of angels. We'll call them the Ophanim and the Seraphim. They said that they chose 1,254 star systems to cast a cat's cradle shadow of themselves in their image and likeness here. The physics of astrology is that the angular arrival of a capacitance wave is how you measure gravity. And so, in fact, the self-similarity of the solar system with respect to the array of those stars created literally a body in their image and likeness. A practical way to measure that is the self-similarity of the Earth's electrical field, which made more gold here than most planets, because gold only happens where ley lines cross in a fractal, and it made the DNA able to become self-aware here more quickly. More fractal you are, more able you're able to unpack awareness. So the solar system had a lot of value according to real estate, location, location, and location. We was fractal. Well, what happened was the Andromedans said, well, why did you deposit those interventionist Alpha Draconis Dracos in our galactic sectors since they were so much trouble? And the answer was, the Ophanim and the Seraphim angels had a conversation about designing a gene pool that could be the solution to the angelic dilemma, which was how to fabricate star births with higher leverage, which is angel birth, and literally how to create a level of psychokinesis, literally power, that hasn't existed in gene pools before. And they did this, what they did is they selected a galaxy a long way from downtown and inserted a gene pool which was able to have enough survival urge to be able to make it in such a hostile environment. And that's the group that went to Alpha Draconis. And the group who said they put them there were called the Patal, P-A-A-T-A-A-L, from which comes our word Ptah, P-T-A-H, and pterodactyl. Okay? And the Patal were said to be 11th dimensional beings, and you can think of them as bird tribe. And I believe that that story is related that the blackboard, here, the continuous family of these gene pools was later described. You have the Ophanim, is the Christian word. You have the bird tribe, is the Iroquois word. And you have the Adawi, is the Cherokee word. And you have the Valnapa, which is the Adnyamatna native Australians word, return of the bird tribes, which are the winged ones. And then over on this side, you have the Seraphim. And the Seraphim eventually became the lineage of Mag. And the Seraphim became the Uru. The Uru part of what was later called Nibiru. Right, Uru, exactly. Uru means dragon or snake or serpent. The snake gods. Okay, and these, the bird tribe, were called Ebi, from Ibis and Iberia, and Geul, which was bird tribe. And when you do the crossing over of these two bloodlines, you get Ebi, Uru, which becomes the word Nibiru and Hebrew. And if you ask a Hebrew rabbi, he will tell you that the word Hebrew means crossing over. Okay, and in fact, on the Uru side, you had a well-developed reptilian brain stem, which was very juicy and useful. Okay? And on the IB side, you had a dog or bird-shaped brain, the dog-bird brain, from which comes our word Dogon and Daganavida. Daganavida. Okay? And this becomes the dog bird, and the group that was the characteristic of the dog bird brain is called Wealawa, and you can read about them at wealawa.com, actually. And the story was that the Orion Queen Mag seraphims had won a high percentage of the inhabitable planetoids in the Orion sector, but a truce was called when they realized the dog bird brains, the Wealawa, would accept in marriage an Orion Queen matriarchal telepathic Mag in marriage with each king on a planetoid of the dog bird. This is very ancient galactic history as told by Robert Morningsky Hopi in the book Guardians of the Grail. But this becomes remnant in later history when the Syrian blood behind Jesus Tutankhamun accepts in marriage the dynastic union with the Mag blood, which was said to be the royal families of the Essenes, but the royal family of the Essenes is actually Egyptian, and it's important to know. But that's getting ahead in our story. So, we're trying to get a sense here of what's later described as the war in heaven. What happened was, apparently, a certain portion of this bloodline had begun to use, had come to the belief that you could speed up evolution by mating mechanical structures directly to biological structures. So you have a mechanical bio group called the cyborg. And the Borgs from the Star Trek series have a great historical meaning in the Orion Wars, I believe. And the mechanical biostructures created a fierce survivalistic telepathic group. And they miscalculated how survivalistic and telepathic this group would become, and eventually they rather took over the Orion sector. The upside of this was they were able to survive better. The downside was they lost passion. They lost glandular passion. And the story of exactly how this happened, which Corinna's live King Cobra snake blood ritual with Montauk Chia in Bangkok, basically was, if you see through the snake blood's memory line, you see that there was a drastic war in which the Orion Queen Mag warriors, which I believe at a later time came to be called the Jehovah warriors, Yod-Heh-Vah-Heh, warriors, in the Orion Wars. And Enlil took the name Jehovah much later for Yahweh. And so what happened was there was a battle and a nuclear beam hit the portion of the Mog lineage, and what happened was after that they had 2 hearts. And the evidence is rather extensive that the Dracos at Montauk and Dulce had 2 hearts, here and here. Highly telepathic, hard to kill. Very powerful, okay? And this became what later was called the Nephilim. This is the important word here, Nephilim, which is well referred to in Bible and correctly described as the fallen ones, the ones who lost implosion in their DNA and all of the psychokinesis and ensoulment that went with it. So the loss of implosion and ensoulment in DNA became not the whole seraphim bloodline, but just a branch, a small part of that bloodline fell. But the part of that bloodline that did fall was a big part in the recent genetic engineering in our planet. And the whole seraphim angelic family is heartbroken about having lost a fractionated piece of their soul group. We're not saying the seraphim are bad. The word seraphim here comes from Asaru. Asaru. The Asaru was the name for the Orion Queen warriors, Asa, which then becomes our word Sarah, which we'll see later, means wife of Ra, the sun god. Okay? Well, that's a sort of galactic history. It's a big picture. The Empire Strikes Back, the Holy Orion conflict. Earth's history is just a recent skirmish in the Orion conflict. You can see the result of the Orion conflict by simply looking at the local picture in the galactic sector, and you see the spiral arms of the section of the galaxy around Orion is screwed up. Literally, the stars do not fit a spiral so well. The fabric of time got fractionated because of the Orion Wars. We cannot die. We have seen the starships burning off the shoulders of Orion. Remember Tron? Anybody knows what a Tron is? Tron is one who can remember the phase angle between the circle and the line, and thus carry biological memory through time travel interactively. Remember, interactive dynamic, I'm going fast here. Interactive dynamic time travel is the solution to the arriving predatory ETs at wingmakers.com, which is a site I highly recommend, wingmakers.com, along with lettersfromandromeda.com. The only thing wingmakers.com gets wrong is the source of the BST, blank state technology, interactive dynamic time travel. They regard it as a mechanical problem. It's clearly a psychological problem as well. To get interactive dynamic time traveler literally means you need to be a time lord, right? Able to travel in time interactively. When your DNA goes through the speed of light, it necessarily inhabits time. And the time fabric itself must be fractal, and that was an Ophanic agenda, the repair of the fabric of time, which later becomes a Templar agenda. But we get ahead of our story. The question sort of was who set up whom here. It gets to be a bit of a catch-22. Let's play with that. Okay, and that's your question too, in a way. Well, who done it? Well, that's the big picture. That's the Orion Wars. Now let's get local. And by local, let's visit the star Sirius at the time when the Orion sector Queen Mogs have run and ruled with terror a high percentage of the inhabitable planetoids. And the regent at that time was a fellow named An, or An-Tu, from which comes our word Solari An, and Tuathade Danan, which means the sun gods or the people of the gods. An, Anu. Anu was the regent and the Syrian sector who was responsible to the Orion contingent, literally equivalent to what was described as the trading houses in Dune. And An had 2 sons. An's 2 sons, let's look at him in the center. An's 2 sons, he had other children, but his 2 sons were Enki and Enlil. And Enki and Enlil were the brothers of East of Eden, which is the basis of the Arab-Israeli conflict today. And An's 2 sons had the same dad but a different mom. The dad was An-Tu, who was this regent on Sirius. The different mom was the fact that Enki's mother was a high-winged Draco, whose blood has not fallen. Sometimes the word for the winged Draco is called Siakar, and you'll see that in a few places in the literature. And it relates to the Christian word for cherubim. Okay? So at any rate, Enki's mom had winged DNA. And the winged DNA means if you're clairvoyant and you look, you see that the arc angle of magnetism leaving their heart appears to have wings. It's implosive. the bird tribes, the winged ones. So Enki had a mom that allowed him to learn the skill of ensouling DNA. Now that's not a mystery to you now that we've spent 2 days saying exactly what it means to ensoul DNA. Remember, how do you turn lightning into ball lightning? You teach the tornado to eat its own tail, right? Well, that's how you make ensouled DNA, and it's how you bring people back from the dead. So later when Enki's kids, which becomes the Jesus Tutankhamun story, you can understand why they only were able to ensoul DNA and bring people back from the dead. Whereas Enlil's mom was of the fallen DNA, so Enlil becomes the conservative brother who says, well, we got to follow the rules. And the Orion Empire the Orion Empire paid a huge investment for the artificial mining planetoid called Nibiru because they needed the gold powder desperately. Sitchin says they were using the gold to repair the atmosphere of the home planet, which is true, but it's a cover story. The fact is they were eating the gold. And they were eating the gold because they were addicted to the gold powder. It was the only way they could speed up their DNA after they fell, the Nephilim, right? So Enki takes the name Ea, for whom earth is named. And later he takes the name Adon and Adonai as Tutankhamun. And Enlil and his lineage is that of Thoth, Hermes, Akhenaten, and Tutankhamun. And the story of Tutankhamun was later lied about, and the myth was changed to the story of Jesus, which is really the story of Tutankhamun. So that lineage there is the bloodline of Enki, whereas Enlil took the name Yahweh and Michael, Mikael, and Mikabo, after Michael, became the word for God in most of the native Indian languages, and Mikabo means literally Enlil. So here you have two arriving brothers along with the sisters Inanna and Ninhursag, and they arrive in this artificial gene splicing planetoid Nibiru, towed into orbit as it were here. And this family called the Annunaki get really bored and angry having to dig up the gold themselves, so they have to make some gold mining slaves. You heard this story before, and that story becomes Adam and Eve. Basically, what happened is they took Cro-Magnon. First they took, Enki did it, Enlil just copied, but he took Cro-Magnon's sperm and put it in an Anunnaki egg, and they made the first, what were called Takadama. Takadama means Borg or donkey from Orion. A Tak means Orion, and Adama means donkey or Borg, from which comes the word Adam, as in Adam and Eve. And so these first genetic experiments were not fertile. This was very crude attempt at cloning. These guys were klutzes, okay? And so when we mistranslate the Sumerian and call it the Bible, in fact, we're describing some very low-level genetic engineering. It ain't anything to be proud of, and they're not proud of it today, I assure you. But just to give you an idea of the shape and appearance of these beings, I'll just show you. I think, did we look the other day at the Lion Place? Lion Path? Lion Path, here it is. So here's the Sumerian goddess statue. Okay, also this is Sumerian goddess figures from the Ubayyad, but somebody correctly pointed out that these statues are much older than Sumeria. Sumer means more than South Sea. It also means in the lineage of the Merovingians. And this is the interventionist Anunnaki, sometimes called Anuhazi, which relates to our story of Anasazi. And this is the Dracos. So the Draco bloodline from Alpha Draconis, Arrakis was a planet in Alpha Draconis. The star map of Alpha Draconis is at Senshi in China and Angkor Wat. Okay? So here you have the interventionist Draco, and here you have the crossbreed Anuhazi, and here you have the winged Draco Siakar. And here you have the Sumerian goddess statue. Now here's the morph. Okay. So here is straight out of the drawings of actual witnesses at Montauk and Dulce and elsewhere of the Alpha Draconis. This is from Anna Hayes' book, Voyagers. So I'm just giving you an idea that what came to later be called God were literally medium-grade interventionist reptile klutz genetic engineers. I'm sorry, but that's my opinion. Maybe you're not interested in my opinion. So it's not all of an insult to the origin of our gene pool here. I'm going to hit stop, close this. Why don't you turn the lights back on here? Well, let's go back to the blackboard, okay? So what's happening here is that Enki and Enlil then realize they need a fertile lineage of these Takadama, these genetic experiment. And what they do is they put a Cro-Magnon egg inside an Annunaki female and use an Annunaki sperm. And this is the bullet in the furnace. This is the moment at which Enki, Ea, disobeys the Orion laws about what you can and cannot do with DNA. This is a crime punishable by death. He's literally putting the bullet in the furnace because he uses his own DNA. He uses his own sperm. Because when the Orion Queen said you could do some genetic experiments here, they very clearly said cross, not branch. X chromosome, Y chromosome. X chromosome could receive a sperm, but Y chromosome couldn't give one because they knew how to fractionate a gene pool. The female could enfold, but if the male gave sperm, then the gene pool would fractionate. So this was the rule. But Enki, Ea, An, they were angry in the Orion Wars because the Syrians were stepped on and ruled with terror by these Orion Queen Mogs, which is where the fear of women came from on this planet. This was a matriarchy originally. Remember, this is a huge old story. We're telling only a tiny piece of the story. So Enki uses his sperm, and that's why he's called Pa, P-T-A-H, from Pa-Tau. The story was that Sarah, Asa-Ra, wife of Ra, the sun god, and Sarah, coming from Ur was a city in Mesopotamia, so the story is not of one person. That story is a story of a family lineage. The Asaru came from Uru, the snake capital, and to Egypt, and Ptah, Enki, fell in love with Sarah, and Ea, Enki, did fall in love with his own genetic experiments, no question. He had his weaknesses too. And so he gave sperm to a Asaru, and in the Cro-Magnon egg, he gave sperm in Ninhursag and Inanna, and the child there was Eve or Isis. And that was the first fertile human female. And so what he had done, this is the bullet in the furnace. The bullet in the furnace that's exciting for you and me is, in Ea's sperm was some of the high-winged ophanic DNA. That was highly psychoactive DNA that the whole Orion Syndicate had no idea how explosive this bullet in the furnace was going to become. So the evolution of that DNA, that memory line, that winged one, can grow up in us, and this is the lineage here. This is what became known as the Disposani in the Holy Blood, Holy Grail series of books. This was, now from here on, now you can pick it up with Lawrence Gardner, who tells only the nice side of the Dracos. Lawrence Gardner is the positive public relations for Alpha Draconis. Okay? And the book specifically is Genesis of the Grail Kings. So here he picks up the story now. Cain, which was the success of the genetic experiment of Adam and Eve, from which comes our word king. The children of Cain were Ea, Enki's attempt to fractalize a soul group, make DNA that could go back into the stars. Because Ea, Enki, if you read the story right, is basically stuck here. If you read the story in Secret Places of the Lion, he's called Merkaba. Ea, Enki is Merk in Secret Places of the Lion. He's Muad'Dib in Dune, and he's Luke Skywalker in Star Wars. And in fact, Luke Skywalker wakes up to find that Dad is half machine. Darth Vader, right? And Muad'Dib in Dune wakes up to find that Dad, Harkonnen, is half machine. Guess what? Dad was half machine. Okay? That's the problem here. That's our history. So what happens then is that Ea, Enki, and his bloodline through Thoth sets up Atlantis, which was called Thule, to try to protect the ensoulment of the bloodline from this lineage here, Enlil, Yahweh, Michael. And this became Amun, from Amun-Ra, which was the name of Yahweh's followers in the early Egypt. And this is why Tutankhamun was forced to take the name Tutankhamun because his dad, Akhenaten, had to run for his life in the deserts when he tries to boot the Amun-Ra priests and Leel's followers out of Egypt. And so when Akhenaten runs for his life in the desert from the priests, Amun-Ra priests, whom he tried to boot out of Egypt, he had to change his name to Moshe, which means son of, which was shortened to the word Moses. But the thing is, Moses got away with the money, made the pharaohs very mad. This is the book Copper Scrolls, the origin of the Essenes in the life of Akhenaten. And so when Tutankhamun goes out to the desert to try to save the life of his father, he gets strung up in a tree. And that was one of the beginnings of the Jesus myth. And you can read the academic justification of the fact that there was no evidence for the life of Jesus in the time of Jerusalem at all in the book Out of Egypt and also the book House of the Messiah. So clearly, the confusion over the Jesus myth is an intentional confusion right here in the Yahweh lineage, who does not want you to know that all of the royal families of this lineage, which became the flagship of Hebrew, all of the royal families came from the blood of Enki. Because only Enki could ensoul DNA. So Abraham, and Sarah had the children, Joseph and Benjamin, the second generation. And the house of Benjamin was the houseland of Magdalene. And the house of Joseph was the house of Tutankhamun. This was Yusuf, actually, which became the house of Tutankhamun, which was later called Jesus. And Tutankhamun's partner, Akhenaten, becomes Magdalene. And you can see the alabaster jars in the cartouche in Egypt. That's all in the books. What it is here is you have a lineage which has taken the view that only obeying the rules about hygiene for DNA can keep the family group intact. Because this group here basically has no skill to ensoul their own DNA. So naturally they would be susceptible to all the additives that actually create sustainable DNA. This group believes in external sources of fire. Okay? So from that point of view, they have no choice but to actually use the only good DNA around, which came from Enki. And Michael became a dragon slayer, literally because Michael was trying to slay the winged Dracos, who was Enki's mother. Okay? And Mikael means from the black hole into God. It has to do with the word for alchemy. It's another story. So the bird tribe is the remnant winged high form of the DNA in Enki. So the return of the bird tribe is literally the story of the return of Enki, which is the title of my new book and the title of Zechariah Sitchin's new book.
So where's the serpents and the birds cross?
The serpents and the birds cross right here, Ebi and Uru. The high form of the serpent DNA, Uru, Kumara, for example, means Draco, dragon, or serpent in South America, Sana Kumara. And the Ebi is Ibis iberia bird train. The Uru is the evolution of the reptilian brain stem. The mouth of Uru, the mouth of the reptilian brain stem, is called amygdala. A-M-Y, amygdala, which means amygdala. And the shape of the amygdala is a half of an almond. The name of Mandelbrot means almond bread, right? And so the amygdala is the place where the serpent brain dumps the testosterone poisoning into the bird brain. So at that point, if the bird brain can hold the serpent brain in a vice-like grip of a raptor, then the reptilian brainstem can dump its juice into the high bird brain, and the serpent feeds the eagle, and Quetzalcoatl returns. That's the point. That is the point. That's the only point. We have these qualities within us. We have met and encountered the enemy, and it is us, said Pogo. Right?
How do we introduce all this to our daily life, and what do we do with this information, and how does it apply to us?
Well, we have a conflict. We have a conflict in Israel, and here you have the people that did not know how to ignite their own fire, gathering like a hive mind around the little remnant source of fire that's still there, the Dome of the Rock, etc., Solomon's Temple, were all names for the geometry necessary to ignite fire magnetically, trying to make a hive that could redeem this DNA. Because remember, these fallen interventionist Dracos now after they shut off the time doors at Montauk and Incunabula and places like that, there was no place for them to go. They're stuck here. So they're stuck here with their own genetic creations. And the sun is about to burp, which means the people who can't time travel without heavy metal are just as bad as a vampire getting toasted in sunlight. Oops. And those are the same reincarnates who put up HARP to try to create an isolationist cocoon in the solar maxima. They're the same ones who cost the atmosphere on Mars. It's a recurrent attempt to create a fractionation in the fabric of time to isolate those whose DNA cannot get up to speed enough to go in. So that controversy plays out here on Earth between those who will and will not take responsibility for the direction of DNA. So basically, by making the choice where you're going to take responsibility for the direction of your own DNA, you essentially vote in these Orion Wars, which on Earth is called Arab-Israel, but it's a microcosm of a bigger conflict. The Greys, or the Coomer, of which there were many different species, came from Zeta Reticuli, and they had suffered under the genetic engineering of the Alpha Draconis here centuries ago, actually millennia ago. So the Greys were at the stool pigeons of Alpha Draconis here. So, for example, when they said the Greys tricked Eisenhower and Truman into accepting abductions after World War II, here's Eisenhower, right? He just won World War II, and then they staged a show for him, showing them that the Greys, ETs, could swat his best aircraft like flies, right? So Eisenhower had such a huge ego, he couldn't admit to the world that he won World War II and lost to the ETs. So instead, he signs on the dotted line and says, okay, you can do abductions. And a few months later, he finds all his best military leaders have been shape-shifted out. There's a detail.
Can you comment on David Icke?
Yeah, I think David Icke is right. I think if you take David Icke and Gardner together, you get a little picture there. And the Montauk survivors, right? The worst thing to do is ignore it. That you should not do. That to me, that's head in the sand, kids. It ain't appropriate, right? So what happens is here, the Dracos used the Greys as kind of stool pigeons to trick Eisenhower and Truman into accepting that treaty. The Draco who was in charge supposedly was a guy named Typhon, which you can read a book about in the book called Genesit in the Holy Blood, Holy Grail series. The other Draco that was involved later was named Charlie. He was the one who ran the Montauk thing. And they were abducting teenagers to steer the time chair. Very educational piece of the puzzle there. Why did the Dracos from Alpha Draconis need human teenagers to steer the time chair at Montauk? Anybody know? Pardon? Well, organ energy, it had to do with the fact that precisely the inability to have DNA that's up to speed enough to travel in time is their soul group fractionation problem. Their fallen DNA, lack of ensoulment, meant that they could not steer the time chair. In fact, the name for the guy that could steer the time chair at Montauk, and all he did is he sat inside a big capacitor that looked like this, called the decadelta antenna. You sit inside a capacitor like this, and the acceleration is called time travel. Well, the guy that sat in there to steer was called the time empath. So it is empathy that sucked into you through the speed of light, the experience in time. And the empath is the one who had the most empathy. Well, they could predict in advance which teenagers they could abduct to steer the time chair by doing a spectrum analysis of their DNA. Which is what I propose we do to prove to the genetic engineers they're costing our children their soul. And that spectrum analysis was called a boson 7 frequency signature, which was a log function of 7 in the braiding algorithm of the DNA that indicated the high gene for bliss. And so you could tell in advance who could travel in time and not come back scrambled eggs. Right? So from this point of view, a lot of the religious experience on Earth is mostly an astral milkhouse. Yeah? And that many people think, well, if I went to church and I got my astral juices sucked out of me, I did a service. Not necessarily. Right? It's when you can steer your own astral bliss and take responsibility for the direction for that you're no longer susceptible to parasites. So this is the whole little piece of the puzzle, little brief summary overview now of a picture that brings us up to the present time. So what happens? Well, the lineage of Tutankhamun, later called Jesus, was a bloodline of Thoth who had a Nubian dark blue blood from Rigel in Orion, actually. And those children, through what was later called Jesus and Magdalene, become the royal families of Europe for maybe 1,000 years. That's called Holy Blood, Holy Grail. So in effect, this Alpha Draconis family is breeding our royal families like we were show dogs for 2,000 years, right? Not necessarily an insult to us, just interesting, right? Well, what happens is the blue blood of the Mag lineage becomes the story of Black Madonna in southern France, yeah, where the Marys went after the Jesus Tutankhamun story was over. And that lineage of those blue bloods, they used copper to hold oxygen in their blood more than the iron. The original story was that the blood was chlorophyll green blazed, and then when they were forced underground by an earlier nuclear catastrophe here described in the Vedas, that some of them went underground and used iron to hold oxygen in the blood. Scandinavia, Iron Man, Adamic race, the red race. Whereas the remnant humanoids at that time went to Sirius and Pleiades, and it's from there that we get this On bloodline. And there they used more copper than iron to hold oxygen in blood and became the blue bloods. And what's interesting is the blue bloods wanted lower oxygen in their atmosphere than the red bloods. And so during a certain time in the Orion Wars, it was literally called the Oxygen Wars because the reptilian shapeshifters can't handle high oxygen in their environment. I specifically recommend that you pass a law that all voting done in your Congress happen in an atmosphere higher than 15 to 18% oxygen because all the reptilian shapeshifters would be out of your senators. Okay? It's very simple. It's very simple, yeah? And so very few people know this. But the physics is the fact that high oxygen is a way to select for high-grade DNA, because low-grade DNA, as we say, cannot withstand the presence of implosion. Finishing the story, so the remnants of the Templars, which was an organization set up to worship Magdalene, which was basically honoring the dragon line, okay, founds this Gothic cathedral array honoring the tantric swoon of Magdalene, and the day the largest navy on the planet disappears under the skull and bones crossbone, which is the skull and bones of Magdalene. Remember, this Orion Queen syndicate used a skull touch, the capacitive spark gap between skulls, to convey long-term memory when the Hive Queen would pass on the lineage. And this became the rite of Baphomet of the Templars. Well, the Skull and Bones Navy was the largest on the planet, and they had invented, quote-unquote, insurance and banking on this planet. Whereas, in fact, the Mag Orion contingent had used insurance and banking. This contingent had used insurance and banking to parasitize hundreds of planets. It wasn't invented on Earth at all. The point is that the Skull and Bones Navy, the largest on the planet, that invented insurance and banking, which paid for the Gothic cathedrals, did the same activity then under the pirates' flagship, the same Skull and Bones. And if you give insurance and banking bad public relations, it's called piracy and extortion. But it's the same activity, or the industry of fear in that sense, right? So this then becomes the story of Holy Grail across the Atlantic, origin of navigating by the stars, and the final book, Pandora's Box, which is how the children of Magdalene and Jesus, Tutankhamun, Oxenfree become the royal families of England, France, and Russia. And the royal family of England then, after Louis XV, comes to America under the name Daniel Pacer, settles at the tailbone of the Eagle, finances a railroad cartel, and becomes the Rockefellers. There's several hundred pages of documentation. And of course, the railroad cartel would be a way you could create hive mind because you'd short out magnetic lines. And the Archons was a name for the winged on. Archon, which became the word Arkansas. And Ozarks were literally the Ozark Mountains. And the Archons at Arkansas, the Rockefellers there, was the bloodline, the illegitimate son of Winthrop Rockefeller, which is the story of Clinton, I believe. And you see the story kind of come up into the present. So the skull and bones of that was the CIA were always, in the case of the pirates and the Templars, were always concerned with the drug cartel because it was regulating access to the corridors of psychokinesis in the magnetic wormholes of the planet. So this origin of the CIA with the skull and bones and the drug cartel, you get the kind of a picture here that there's an interventionist agenda that begins to fall apart at the moment you realize that only high-quality DNA can survive compression. So now with the onset of the solar maxima, there's a ring pass knot here. The end of the story is that between now and 2012, with lots of fire, even 2004, 2006, you have the solar maxima, the rapture we've been discussing. And that experience is a compression wave that essentially tests DNA for compressibility. And the survival of that compression, similar to surviving death, occurs to those who get the hygiene necessary to achieve charge density. Remember, charge density and non-destructive compression are identical. So the act of preparing to die is the same as the activity of preparing for the solar maxima. If the magnetism in your backyard is not fractal, then under the conditions of compression, it will generate heat. So cities whose magnetic lines are not fractal will generate so much heat that the people will go rapidly insane in them. And so this process of preparing for compression is an appropriate way to find out what elements of the gene pools have star-inhabiting capabilities and thus are able to be saved or harvested or really graduate into star-inhabiting. And so that's the kind of suggestion here, is that here's a little, obviously, remember I said, I was about to tell you a fairy tale. I'm not trying to sell you the fairy tale. I don't care if you're even interested in the fairy tale. It's fun. What does matter is if you accept the homework. The homework is to take responsibility for the direction of your bliss juices with the acknowledgement that this is a solution not just to a galactic controversy, but the solution to star inhabiting and the evolution of gene pools in general. There are many stories from several sources that the interventionist ETs have told. The non-interventionist ET families in general are divided, and most people agree on this, from Prism of Lara to Morning Sky to Sitchin, whatever, that the ET families can be divided into the interventionists and the non-interventionists. The non-interventionists are ones who believe that indigenous gene pools must be set free if they're ever to evolve. And the non-interventionist gene pools supposedly include Sirius A, Andromeda, Procyon Tau Ceti, and some of the Cassiopean story. The interventionists include Alpha Draconis, Sirius B, Rigelians to some extent, and others. Summary of that at lettersfromandromeda.com. So which groups were responsible for trying to prop up our ecosystem? But they do say repeatedly that they've sort of passed a law that the interventionist ETs will be essentially kicked out of here by the galactic government within a few years. And so the present conflict, which is predicted, we're going to see a major upwelling of and global trauma within months. Because this is the last stand of those interventionist ETs who are trying to make their last gasp at having control of the genetic library here. I do think loss of individual freedom is a major catastrophe to the possibility of bliss. And setting people free is the opposite of everything is under control, we have a plan for everything. Okay, that mentality, like in the European Union now, it's illegal to have one employee pick up a cement block. It's against the law. They have planned everything. You must have two. So you can't fart without a permit, right? So this is a planet on which freedom is no longer possible. And that is something to rebel against, in my view. And I'm here. The story I thought I'd begin with, for fun, was when we came out here, Noah, what did Noah say about the dude?
Oh, we're walking in the dewdrops, and it had the starlight on it all night. So we absorb it into our skin, all this starlight.
That would really, it's perfect for the theme of the day, because does anybody know the alchemical function of dew, D-E-W, what it's used for in alchemy? It has a very specific...
Rabbits like it.
The rabbits like it, yeah.
Must do them for that.
Well, my initials are D-E-W, so I get a little defensive on this.
Somebody says we don't want any dew around here. Automatic bad reaction.
Yeah, do drop in, right?
Let's walk on the dew.
Yeah, you don't like getting walked on.
Is anybody familiar with the starlight elixirs from Hilarion, Pegasus Press?
Mm-hmm.
So they focus starlight into ordered water, and then they use that water to drink the memory of the civilization on that star and the effect of that star on the Earth. And they literally focus the starlight through a telescope into that water, and the water absorbs the electral geometry of that star. And the book, Starlight Elixirs, is a review of the psychological evolution of hundreds of star systems. So, in fact, it's quite clear that whenever you get a nice spherical little capacitor, like a dewdrop, I have a way of selecting and focusing starlight. Well, you're probably not familiar with the work of Greg Hodowanik and Bill Ramsey, but it's rather famous in psychotronic circles, where they showed that what's called a passive nonlinear dielectric capacitor, it's basically the same kind of capacitor you see in there when I take hemp fibers to measure life force. And when it's seated in a place which is magnetically pristine, and they just use something called a rust track recorder to make a graph of the change in output charge of that capacitor over time. Nothing is triggering it except gravity. And these devices, the rust track recorders, if you ever saw the plots from these things, when Jupiter squares Saturn, it's amazing. Okay, and so there's a whole series of literature about this, which is effectively that a better way to watch stars is through capacitors than telescopes. And the CIA does not want you to know that capacitance can be focused like a lens, because that would mean all the investment in hiding a stealth aircraft to be wasted. But the fact is, charge can be focused like a lens, and that's what gravity does.
And through hemp.
Well, any biological capacitor. It's basically just a way of catching charge. So here you have this model. First of all, Hodowanik and Ramsey showed that the charge density moves literally measurably faster than the speed of light. So when you had these stellar explosions, and there's charts showing it, where a telescope has to wait 3 days for the light to get here, the capacitor didn't wait. No. And all these astrological events, then astronomic events, were mapped with charge. Right? So this is the Hodowanik-Ramsey work. It's pretty famous in some circles. So what is this telling us about the alchemical function of dew? Yeah, see, the theme of today, actually this morning for a while, is around this question of what turns planets green. That is our little theme, our bumper sticker for some conversation here. And so in order to understand what turns planets green, what puts moss on the sphere, atmosphere, get it? Right, what gives us atmosphere? It's the same thing that literally puts moss on a stone. It's called the green stone. Has anybody seen the Green Stone film in the UK? A famous book, The Green Stone, by Phil Squires and Elaine Burlock, I think. The Green Stone in UK, and they started making a movie about it. And it's a book about this stone that has all these powers. Well, in effect, the miracle of the green stone is the fact that it has enough charge to orient magnetism into life. I came out of the door at Adrian's this morning, and there was a yellow flower, and I noticed that the petals of the flower were exquisitely pentagonal. And I put my hand over the flower, and I felt a wave of radiating bliss going through my body, like I often do when I smell a flower, but I didn't smell it. I only felt the charge radiating from the flower. And I thought, somebody steered magnetism into a tornado, yeah? And somebody planted the seed of that tornado, and that's the geometry of charge that steered the water coming from the stone, which we called green. You know? It's like when we saw these slides of the tree, somebody brought the pictures of the tree that's turned in a corkscrew because the underground magnetism went in a spiral. So biological intention plants the seed here for shaping magnetism so that the planet could turn green. We talked about angelic intentions yesterday in shaping a planet that could have a gene pool that become more self-aware than had happened in the stars in a long time. Now, the alchemical function of dew. You take this thing called the Philosopher's Stone. Anybody know what the Philosopher's Stone is made of?
Magnetite?
No, the Philosopher's Stone is a variation on phosphorus, I believe, isn't it? Does anybody remember? It's what do you coat the Philosopher's Stone with? A thin film of mercury. Now, mercury has the atomic mass of gold at the nuclear level, but the valence structure is different, basically. And the phosphorus and the components of the stone have the valence shape of gold, but not the nuclear geometry of gold. Now, if you got a thin film of mercury on the philosopher's stone, what would turn it to gold? First of all, you'd need something to make it into a monoatomic layer so the charge could radiate through it. If anybody's familiar with the literature, we're talking about alchemy now because it's a model for the heart of gold and what turns a planet green. The word alchemy comes from alchem. Chem, C-H-E-M, chem, is from the Egyptian. It's the original name for Egypt, and it means literally from the blackness, and it's the word for black. And alchemy then literally means from the black hole, which is our word for chemistry. So it's a way of navigating in and out of black holes. That's what alchemy is, which is literally how you get pressure through the speed of light in and out of a black hole. And gold is exquisite at doing that because the electron shell geometry is so fractal, so self-similar, so embedded. So literally, when the waves of charge are braided through gold, they're braided into a fractal, and they're able to enter and leave a black hole. This can be evidenced in modern chemistry from the literature that shows that if you take gold in a monofilament, like a thread, and if you shoot high amperage through it at the moment it crystallizes, it is a measurable superconductor.
At the moment it crystallizes.
So in other words, you got this gold monofilament, and you shoot high amperage through it just when it's going from the liquid to the crystal state. The high amperage persuades the molecular array to orient in perfect fractal array. You can model superconductivity by taking the Bucky-Fuller vector flexor and jitterbugging it from Icasa to cube octa, which is literally what molecules do to become a superconductor. And why are they a superconductor? Because when they assume the Icasa dodeca symmetry, the blue model radical ideas, and we want a simple, gentle introduction that the average person can take to heart in a practical way. So, how are we going to think about life in a radically new way? What is it, for example, that makes a tomato really a whole tomato? Obviously, something is organizing all of those molecules in such a way that an electric field has caused an organization which is more than cellular. It's more than atomic. It's a very large, very coherent electric field that causes life. If we understand what builds those fields better, we can serve life. And so that's our goal. So here's how I suggest we begin to think about this. Supposing you had a seed that you wanted to test to see if it's alive or dead. The essential way you find out if a seed is alive or dead, you plant it in the soil and you wait to see if it germinates, obviously. Now, what is it that determines whether a seed germinates? As an electrician, I look at this problem to see if the seed is able to attract the nutrient, the food it needs. If the seed can gather to itself the nutrient, it begins to germinate. Obviously, it is the water that brings with it the nutrient to the seed. So, in effect, the seed is going to be able to germinate and bring life to itself if it's able to change the angle and steer in, like a tractor beam, the approaching water molecule. So the essential question an electrician has to ask to see what makes a seed alive is what gives it the strength to have an electric field strong enough to suck in and attract a water molecule. Pause.
Recording.
So what is it about water molecules that enable the electric field to be assembled, to be sucked in? If we look at the way in which water naturally organizes itself, we see that when water is arranged in biologic structures, it actually becomes more orderly than ice. And in extreme cases, we've seen that water actually organizes itself into pentagonal, that is, five-sided, and dodecahedral structures. Here's some images. So in effect, what happens is that the water arranges itself into what might be seen as a three-dimensional fractal to enable charge compression. Charge compression being the key word. We recall to mind the Albert Szent-Györgyi Nobel laureate prize-winning work at Marine Woods Hole Biologic Laboratories, where he showed that in electronic biology and cancer, that it's the extreme orderliness of the water that's the difference between a healthy cell and a cancer cell. Now it turns out the nature of that orderliness in water and its charge field is based on essentially two things. The hydrogen in the water appears to have golden mean ratio in the emissions of it's called the Balmer series. It just means that it's probably true that hydrogen at the monoatomic level is in fact implosive. This is what's
behind, for example, Dr. Pat Flanagan's monoatomic hydrogen microhydrin. And in that, he also takes that monoatomic implosive hydrogen atom, compression again, implosion, at the center of water, and he tucks it inside a dodecahedron, pentagonal dodecahedron. I'll let you see it in here, the white balls. He tucks it inside a dodecahedron of water molecules, which in the technical literature is called a Claff-Rate cage of water molecules. So these are all examples of the fact that Mother Nature appears to use golden mean ratio optimized self-similarity to create charge compression, to create life. For example, again, it appears that almost every living biologic protein, is in fact five-sided. Visualize, for example, the top-down view of DNA, where you have the 5-10 view. This is all golden mean ratio, golden mean spiral based in DNA. So whether it's DNA or every living protein, it appears Mother Nature has used this golden mean ratio to create a path called implosion, where waves add and multiply non-destructively, something called their phase velocities, to turn compression into acceleration, sometimes called gravity. This ability to turn compression into acceleration, called non-destructive compression, appears to be the key to not just making gravity from charge, but making life itself. This is a very important point. So, what we want to do is first prove the concept that, in fact, life force is the ability to invite charge compression, and then we can show that there are certain electrical environments which will cause seeds to germinate, and they will, in fact, enable compression. Example, a fractal is science's best way to invite compression. It turns out that Mother Nature uses things that are like fractals, that is self-similar. Visualize a pine cone. Visualize a fern tree. Visualize the layers of an onion. Visualize the little doll inside the bigger doll. These are all images where the inside is so self-similar to the outside that it invites non-destructive compression, and this ability to suck in charge turns out to be the essence of how to create an electric field that will cause a seed to germinate. Remember, in our traditional history, we've had too many names for the electric field of life. It's been called Chi, Orgone, Baraka, Shaktipat. We have waves of Ek. We have too many names for this principle, and we need to understand that there is a unified field, as Christ and Einstein would emphasize, and that in order to understand that unified field, we must understand our universe in terms of a rigorous language, and in physics, that's the language of the symmetry of charge. And that is the unified field for physics. A measurable example, if we measure the charge wave that comes off an essential oil made from roses that's very healing, we see that the electric field that came off that charge wave that heals has a self-organizing nature. It looks like a caduceus. It's initializing this compression wave. So if you visualize a rose, you're in fact visualizing its electric field. And the electric field means you could zoom in, you could compress, you could fall into the center. The wave inside the wave could compress forever. Let's translate this into something very vivid for your imagination. In Russia, they had whole groups of school children who were blind, who were taught over years to create a very specific state of consciousness, which we might call bliss, ecstasy, transcendence, creativity, or even enlightenment. And this very specific state of consciousness, this bliss state, enabled these large groups of blind children to in fact see even though they were blindfolded. What enabled this perception? They were instructed psychologically to very clearly imagine themselves in pristine and gorgeous nature. And when they did, their body would enter into a well-defined and measurable electric state called bliss that allowed them perception, peak perception, seeing through their skin even if they're blind. Now, Professor Korotkov measured this electric state, and it became the basis of our bliss tuner. And the electric state, one of its primary indicators was the harmonics of the brain waves, the EEG, came into that same golden mean ratio to make the caduceus. So to simplify, if your body becomes convinced it's in nature, it says, oh boy, I'm going to suck in charge now because, in fact, this field enables compression. And compression enables the charge distribution called life. So what happens? Your body makes itself into golden mean ratio, like a great big pine cone, invites compression, sucks in charge called implosion, begins getting the voltage from gravity that we call bliss, and the TM meditators even float and make gravity at that point. Your brain waves come into golden mean ratio, and you begin inviting your world to embed or fall into your body. So, whether it's a seed, a tomato, your body, or your planet, things become alive when they can attract charge, because in the very center, an infinite number of waves can converge non-destructively, and that permission to touch for that number of different waves creates perfect charge distribution, the result of perfect charge compression. And that charge radiance is the aura you see from a saint with a halo. It's the Kirlian photograph. It's the emoto, the sensitive crystallization processes in the blood. These are all ways for simply imaging the radiated projected charge field, the chi, the ka, the ba, which is life itself. So, if we can teach our children to invite compression, then we can teach them to sustain life. Blood itself is